Thanks for sharing that, Bobby. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good to see you all. I've missed you all dearly. Really happy to be back. And just had something simple to share. I feel like I learned a lot in the last few weeks. I'm not going to even try to share it all, though. Instead, I just wanted to share something simple and practical related to I'd written a little blog post a few weeks ago called Feeding on God's Faithfulness, which was something that really encouraged me, and I feel like I learned something practical as a way to do that I wanted to share. Because in that blog post I mentioned how it's so important to cultivate our heart's attitude towards the Lord and to set the Lord before us regularly, so that as we're in the world and kind of buffeted by trials and circumstances, we're feeding on God's goodness, and the things in the world aren't the things that sustain us, but God's who and what sustains us. There's a psalm which I read which reminded me of that, and it's given me some practical kind of something simple to do, which I really appreciated. It's Psalm 77. And it's a psalm of Asaph, who is, as far as I can tell, he seems grieved because of some of the difficulties of life and living in a time of turbulence. In verse 2, he says, "In the day of trouble I sought the Lord." And his soul refused to be comforted, it says. But what I wanted to read is starting in verse 7. He says, "Will the Lord reject forever, and will he never be favorable again? Has his loving kindness ceased forever? Has his promise come to an end forever? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Or has he in anger withdrawn his compassion?" Then I said, "It is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed." And what I saw there is it's him saying, it's not true that God has changed. God hasn't changed actually at all. But my feelings have made me feel like he has. And then he goes on to say in verse 11, "I shall remember the deeds of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your deeds." And so what I see there is Asaph is saying that grief causes him to doubt God. His emotions got him wondering whether God was true. But what he did is he didn't examine his feelings. I think there's a lot of talk about getting in touch with our feelings. But he didn't do that. What he did instead was he examined God's track record. He said, "Hey, I'm feeling this way. What am I going to do? I'm going to look at all of the ways that God's been faithful to me. I'm going to recount all of the ways that he has been good. And I'll remember the deeds of the Lord and his wonders of old. And I'll meditate on all his work." And it's something that's really encouraged me that I should do this too, that to find God to be glorious whenever I'm feeling down or doubtful. It's not, I don't need to look at my emotions. I don't need to examine my emotions or wonder why I'm feeling that. What I need to do is I need to look at what God's done in my life, and I need to be reminded of how he's been faithful and how he's worked in his people's lives. I mean, in this chapter, Asaph goes on to talk a lot about the deeds, mighty deeds of God in the lives of Israel. But there's something else that I've seen here which has really encouraged me, which is I've had some various family issues in the last few weeks which have really gotten me wondering, how do I raise children who, in the fear of the Lord, to really love God and to cherish him and to reverence him with their lives? How do I do that? Who truly want to honor him? And it made me think that it's good to keep track of all the amazing things that God has done. And we ought to tell stories of God's faithfulness to our kids too. It's not enough in my time of grief that I comfort myself with what God's done, but I actually should be open about it and talking about it plainly with my children, and they should become almost family stories in a way. That God's faithfulness should be family stories that become cherished. And I see that in the next psalm, in Psalm 78. In verse 4, Asaph again says, "We will not conceal them from our children, but tell to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wondrous works which he has done." And he says, "For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should teach them to their children that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they might arise and tell them to their children, that they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And he spends the next, if you look at Psalm 78, probably 60 verses recounting much of Israel's history and God's faithfulness. And I'd like to do the same. This has really encouraged me as I think about raising children who fear the Lord. I'd like to start being diligent. This is something God's really laid on my heart, to start being diligent, to keep track of the ways that God's been faithful to me, and to not forget them, and to not take it lightly, but to really actually write it down, and to make it a part of my family story, so to speak. You know how, I don't know about you and your family, but in my biological family, there's all these stories that basically every year get told and retold. And we all know how they end, but we all act like we don't, and then we laugh at the same punchline, right? And it's funny, but that's how it is with family, right? It's these stories that get retold over and over, and the same person always tells them, and we all suspend our disbelief, and it's great. But it just made me think, I want stories of God's faithfulness, how he's worked in our life. I want it to be so familiar to my kids, even, that when it's like, oh, there goes Dad again, talking about the time that, Grandma moved out here and we didn't know where she's going to live. And in one day, God allowed us to find a place for her to live. In one day, can you believe it? And they're like, yeah, Dad, I know, it's amazing. Like, I would love, not really, but I'd love for that same kind of exasperation and, familiarity that I feel with kind of funny family stories in my history. I'd love for those stories of God's faithfulness to be so regularly told and cherished. That it's a testimony to my kids, and I want them to be just as familiar with those stories as they are with the funny things that are going to happen in our lives, because together we regularly made it a habit to marvel at God's faithfulness, and we kept track of it. If you look at Psalm 78, this is not somebody who's been oblivious to the workings of God and his people. He's been highly aware and thoughtful and diligent to maintain a record. And it's really caused me, I've started making a list, just 2015. Don't even worry about the past. I have a terrible memory. But just this year, what's God done? And it's amazing, actually, as I start to look at some notes and things, I find there's an amazing list that honestly I'd probably just forget if I wasn't kind of encouraged to be diligent to keep track of it. There's another psalm that says something similar, but there's a phrase I really liked. It's Psalm 48. It's by the sons of Korah. And in Psalm 48 in verse 9, I love this. It says, "We have thought on your loving kindness, O God, in the midst of your temple. As is your name, O God, so is your praise to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is full of righteousness. Let Mount Zion be glad. Let the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgments. Walk about," and this is what caught my attention, "walk about in Zion and go around her. Count her towers. Consider her ramparts. Go through her palaces, that you may tell of it to the next generation. For such is God, our God forever and ever. He will guide us unto death." And what I see here is this, what kind of grabbed a hold of my heart is it's this conscious effort to take an inventory. Count her towers, consider her ramparts, go through the palaces that you may tell of it to the next generation. Really take an inventory of all the goodness of God so that I can proclaim it to my next generation. So I'm really trying to do a better job of writing these things down and talking about them openly, so that they can become a part of my family story. I think it's a very practical way that I have found that I can feed on God's faithfulness.